Let's look at the browser rendering flow and display properties in CSS and how they affect your HTML and your CSS when you're laying out your website. So the way a browser generally works is that when it renders your website, it reads your HTML from the top to the bottom, and it tries to place each element beside the previous element unless something prevents it. So it kind of flows a little bit like how words wrap in a text editor like Microsoft Word. So the words go beside each other until you get to the end of the line, and then they go down to the next line. In HTML, in websites, CSS or elements will bump to the next line under a few different conditions. So one is like a word editor where there's not enough space to actually display that element on that one line, or CSS could cause it. So there could be some CSS property that's causing it to go to the next line, or it could be a BR tag that causes the element to wrap to the next line. So let's go and look in our HTML and let's write a couple tags in here to see what actually happens. So I'll just start with a span and just put some text in here, so planets. So if I render this in my browser, you can see it's just one word like that. Okay, so I'll go back to my text editor and I'll put another span, say Mercury. All right, back to Chrome, and there you go. You can see Mercury is up beside planets. And the browser will keep trying to do this unless there's not enough space. So let's put another one in here, span. I'll put a strong this time. The sun. And you can see all of these are lined up together right beside each other. But if I resize my window here, when they run out of space, you can see they go down to the next line. Just like that. So the browser will try and put things beside the previous line unless there's not enough space by default. Okay, so another situation would be then, let's look at how an image affects the flow. So I have an image right here, src equals venus.jpg. All right. So I'm going to put my image in here, and we'll go back to Chrome, and there you go. So now you can see, look, the image is even beside the text because there was enough room in the window. But if I make it a little bit smaller, the image goes underneath. So everything is trying to fit beside the previous element unless there's not enough room. So that's our first condition. If there's not enough space, things will go down to the next line. The next condition then would be that CSS could cause it. So let's create a paragraph here. All right, so I've created a paragraph. Now I'll go back to Chrome, and look, you can see right here, here's my paragraph, I'll highlight it. It is on its own line. Even if there is enough space, it's not going up beside the other elements. So why is that? Well, that's because there's CSS associated with this paragraph. I'm going to click on it in the web inspector, and you can see right here, the browser has applied the property display block to this paragraph tag. And this display block is forcing it onto its own line. These other elements that we created, the span, the strong, the image tag, those are all inline level elements. So by default, without any CSS, elements are inline level elements. Just there are certain elements that the browser has gone ahead and put display block for us. So you can see here, paragraph is one of those. Let's go back and let's create another one. Let's do an H1. The solar system. Okay, so here's an H1. I'm going to go back to Chrome, and look, you can see it's on its own line, and if I inspect it, you can see again, it's set to display block. And one more, let's look at the div element. So div Neptune. All right, so here is a div element, and you can see, look, the div element is again on its own line. So if we compare what the difference between a span element and a div element are, is if we click on span here, you can see the browser hasn't applied any CSS to it. But if we click on the div, you can see the browser has set it to display block. So by default, elements will be display inline, and they'll try to fit beside each other unless there is some sort of CSS to force them onto their own line. Now with this comes a couple other interesting things. So let's go and put a background color on our div and our span elements. So I'm going to target my span here, and I'll put a background color on it because I just want to see where it is on the page. So I'll make them red, and I'll target my div, and let's make those green. Okay, so we can see here, here's my spans, here's my div. Now you can see the spans are really compressed. They're taking up only as much space as they need. So they're taking up just a little bit of space, just enough to wrap around the words. On the div here, you can see that it's taking up essentially a whole line. So anything that comes after the div goes to the next line because there's not enough space. Anything that is before it is on the previous line because this is taking up the whole space. So a div element then is block, which means it takes up a whole line, whereas a span element is inline, which means it takes up only as much space as it needs. Okay, so let's add another interesting thing to this. Let's put some padding on these. So let's go padding 1em and padding 1em. Okay, so here we have just increased the padding on these, and you can see, look, there's padding around the planets, the red boxes, and around the green boxes, so that works fairly well. Let's go now and put a width on them. So width of 5em. That's probably not enough. Let's do 15em. Okay, so now this is kind of interesting. You can see the div here is 15em wide, but the span elements are still the same width as they were before. On inline level elements, you can't control the width, so they're only as wide as they need to be. Block level elements, you can control the width. So let's look at another idea here. What if I wanted an inline level element, like let's say I look at the sun right here, which was a strong element, and I want it inline because I want the other two elements beside it, but I do want to be able to control its width. So I could target it, and let's put a background color on it so we can see it. Clearly we want to make that yellow. Alright, so I'm going to put padding just so it matches the other ones, and I'm going to put a width on it, let's say 10em. Now this right now, the width is not going to work. You can see the width is not happening. But we do want a width. So what we could do is set this to display inline block. So inline block is then a hybrid between the two. So now you can see it's applying the width, but the elements are still beside it. So span elements by default are display inline, which allows other elements to go up beside them. And div elements by default are block, which means that they sort of exist on their own line. They'll go down to their own line, and every element that comes after them will go to the line below. And then there's the hybrid one, the inline block level. You can see I set it here, which allows us to give it some width and margins and stuff while still retaining the sort of flow properties of an inline level element.